30% das vagas nas universidades do Estado para estudantes formados em escolas públicas, com reserva de uma parcela mínima destas vagas para os afrodescendentes e indígenas. E aumento do número de bolsas de estudo para alunos com este perfil nas universidades privadas. Está em discussão no Congresso o projeto de lei com que o governo pretende solucionar provisoriamente a demanda por ensino superior no Brasil. Há 4 décadas, nos Estados Unidos, esta é a política de ações afirmativas, implantada como importante instrumento de combate ao racismo contra os negros americanos. Mas nem todos estão de acordo com ela. O economista americano Thomas Sowell é um inimigo declarado da ação afirmativa. Dedicou grande parte de sua obra a provar que ela tem efeitos negativos para as próprias minorias que pretende beneficiar, além de prejudicar a sociedade como um todo. Em seu último livro, Ação Afirmativa ao Redor do Mundo, que está sendo publicado no Brasil pela editora Universidade, Sowell analisa as experiências de países como Índia, Ceilão, Paquistão e Nigéria. E conclui que, em todos os casos, leis para promover a igualdade tiveram um efeito oposto. Sowell recebeu o repórter Jorge Pontual na Universidade de Stanford, na Califórnia, onde conduz suas pesquisas.
You have looked closely at the results of programs for affirmative action in many countries, and in none you have seen success. Why that?
Well, most of the time, the things that people want, university admissions, high-level jobs, and so forth, are things for which you have to have prerequisites. And the people who are already more fortunate have those prerequisites, and those who are poor typically don't. And so it doesn't do any good to have a reserve a place for people of one group or another in a medical school when the person who's poor is very unlikely to have reached the point where he'll ever get to the medical school application process. And so you get a very disproportionate amount of the benefits going to a very small and already more fortunate group. It's a wonderful way for people who are affluent to become rich, but that is not the social problem in most of these countries.
The first laws that created group preferences were adopted in India by the British colonial administration. What happened there?
One result has been that these preferences have spread far beyond the untouchables. Most of the untouchables have gotten nothing out of this. Those relatively few already affluent untouchables have gotten the lion's share of the benefits. And the other groups, who are much more fortunate than the untouchables, they have really gotten far more of the preferences than the untouchables ever did.
But what happened in India, was there an increase in violence between the groups, between races and different groups?
Oh yes, there's been great increased violence, particularly against the untouchables.
Why?
Because they are perceived as having an unfair advantage, even though the great bulk of them get nothing out of this. One of the tragic cases of some years ago was a riot in which 42 people were killed over 6 places in a medical school in Gujarat. Moreover, most of the places that are set aside for untouchables go unfilled because they don't have enough of them who are qualified to get into these places, even with lower qualification standards. But so they get the brunt of the hostility, but they don't get the bulk of the benefits.
Because other groups feel discriminated.
Other groups find that this is the way they can get preferences, whether they're discriminated against or not. And so they do. And politically, it's always easier to add another group to the list. And of course, the more groups you add, the more you dilute the preferences for those who really were truly badly off to begin with.
How have the different programs of affirmative action that you looked into been detrimental to society at large and to the groups targeted?
Certainly the antagonism is a high cost to the society at large. It's a high cost to the members of the group. You also have the members of these groups who have, with great effort in many cases, elevated themselves on the basis of their own qualifications. And they go on under a cloud in any case. That is, if some black student, for example, graduates #1 in his class in Harvard, he will still go out into the world under the cloud that he only got in because he was black. Now, he may have gotten in whether he was black or not, but we will never know that because there will then be this general presumption of less competence.
One example that you studied is Sri Lanka, a country that was very peaceful, and then affirmative action programs for the Tamil minority were adopted. And what happened there?
Well, it was not only peaceful, it was held up by many people inside and outside Sri Lanka as a model for the rest of the world to show how a majority and a minority could live together in peace. There was not a single race riot between the Tamils and the Sinhalese in Sri Lanka during the first half of the 20th century. During the second half of the 20th century, there were not only riots, there was outright civil war. And this little country lost more lives during its civil war than the United States lost during all the years of the Vietnam War.
But how was affirmative action involved in that?
The Tamils were doing better than the Sinhalese, the Tamil minority, for a number of historical reasons. And the Sinhalese resented that. When the country became free and began to have elections, one of the politicians decided his best chance to become prime minister was to push for preferences for the Sinhalese. And of course, once he did that, that made life impossible for the Tamils. Because where the Tamils lived was a very poor part of the country, and without being able to get into an education and into the professions, they really had very little future. Eventually, the Tamils decided they wanted to secede, and so civil war broke out. And only in the past couple of years has there been a ceasefire in that civil war, very belatedly after decades of slaughter.
It seems from your studies that in all those countries that adopted those programs of racial quotas, politicians used that. There was a lot of demagoguery involved. Why?
Well, it's always easy to say, particularly when it's some group that isn't performing as well as another group, to blame somebody else. People would much rather believe that their misfortunes are due to somebody else rather than to themselves. In many cases, their misfortunes may be due to historical factors over which they had no control. But the fact is that if they want to advance from where they are, they're going to have to acquire skills and do other kinds of things that are necessary. This is a distraction from that. This says to people, you don't have to measure up to what other people do. They owe it to you, and therefore you're to get this anyway. It's a double-edged thing, because not only do they usually not get very much out of it all, the slackening of their own efforts probably does them more harm than any benefits they're going to be given by the government.
The advocates of affirmative action claim that it has been one of the main factors for the creation of a black middle class in the U.S. Is that true?
No. The easiest way to look at that is that the black middle class existed before affirmative action existed. It has not grown faster under affirmative action. In fact, if you go back to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the number of blacks rising into professional and other high-level occupations was greater in the 5 years prior to that legislation than in the 5 years following that legislation. So the black middle class grew primarily out of the black colleges where there was no affirmative action. And even to this day, in some of the scientific fields, the bulk of black PhDs came out of the black colleges, not out of the Harvards and Yales and other such places.
In Brazil, affirmative action is being introduced in universities. In the American universities, what has been the effect of affirmative action?
You've had a very high failure rate among the minority students brought in. And it's not because these students weren't qualified. At Berkeley, for example, during the era of affirmative action, over half the black students failed to graduate. Now, the average black student at Berkeley during that period scored higher than the average American student in the country at large. They were failing because they were at Berkeley, where you had the top, 10% of white students and the top 5% of Asian students. And so they were just simply overwhelmed. I mean, I saw this when it first came in Cornell, that there were many black kids there who would have sailed through and graduated with honors somewhere else. It's just that you can't make up in a few years for what you don't have otherwise. In my own classes, I gave a lot of reading assignments. Now, the average student at Cornell at that time had an SAT of 700, which meant they were fantastic readers. They could just go right through a book at high speed and know all of it. Very few people in the world can do that. Now, here, along comes a black student who's let in under affirmative action. He's a good student. He does well, but he can't do that, as most white students can't do that. But he's put into Cornell, and so we go whizzing along, and he's left behind. He doesn't learn things that he is perfectly capable of learning if it's taught at a normal pace.
But why wouldn't the black student be able to do that?
Oh, not as good a previous education. I mean, it's one thing if you've been through Andover or Exeter or any of these other high-priced schools and you've been taught all this. It's another thing if you come out of a ghetto school where the standards are much lower, and after 12 years of that, you can't make that up in a summer or in any other period of time that's going to get you through a high-powered school with the kind of results that you really want.
What has happened in California and Texas, the two largest American states, where the voters abolished affirmative action a few years ago?
There were great outcries that there would be no minority students in the university system and so on. In point of fact, there are now more minority students in the university system than there were prior to the ending of affirmative action. They redistributed themselves. There are fewer minority students